right, welcome everyone. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started. All right, hopefully that started again. Thanks for catching that, Miriam. So like I mentioned, Professor Graczyk works on restoring or augmenting sensory function after injuries. And her work is really exciting to me because it's at this intersection of basic research with clinical application. And she works applying the latest techniques in human patients directly. And so she's received many awards that recognize her really innovative approach, including a DARPA Riser Award that is specifically for early career faculty that are really making an impact in the field. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Graczyk to tell us about the latest in using electrical stimulation to restore sensation.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for those really kind words and that great introduction, Dr. Osborne. And thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be able to connect with you all. I really wish this could have been in person. I had planned to come to your seminar in person. Unfortunately, I had some changes to my teaching schedule this semester and was not able to make it out there. But I'm glad I'm able to connect with you virtually. Like Dr. Osborne said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Case Western Reserve University. And I'm actually very new. I just started this past July. I also have a position at our affiliated VA Medical Center. So I'm going to talk to you today about some work that my lab is doing to work on tools for sensory neurostimulation to restore function and enhance human connection. Okay. So when I talk about sensation in this talk, I'm specifically meaning somatosensation, that is touch and proprioception, or the sense of limb positioning and movement. And my lab focuses specifically on sensation in the hand and upper limbs. In your hands, sensation has a lot of different roles. It's very important. It helps us to manipulate objects that we might need to encounter in our daily lives. For example, picking up a berry off of a bush, you need to be able to apply enough pressure to accomplish this very fine task, but not too much pressure that might then damage the berry that you're trying to acquire. Sensation also helps us regulate our motor output in tool use. We actually have specialized receptors that pick up really fine vibrations that help us when we're using tools to be able to manipulate them effectively. And another really exciting area of touch, to me at least, is the way that it influences our emotional connection with other people. You may, hold somebody's hand or pat them on the back. These are ways that we connect with those that we love and communicate with those we love. So my lab uses neurostimulation to create these sensory percepts. Sensory neurostimulation could be at a variety of levels across the nervous system. My lab has studies that are ongoing at a couple different levels. So we do have a few studies that are related to surface or transcutaneous electrical stimulation. I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end of the talk. A lot of our studies have to do with peripheral nerve stimulation. These are with chronically implanted neural interfaces. In particular, we use extraneural interfaces like the flat interface nerve electrode. And we also have a new study that I'm going to touch on a little bit today that uses stimulation of the cortex, the primary somatosensory cortex, through microelectrode arrays. So for those who may be unfamiliar with sensory neurostimulation, I have a brief animation here to kind of show you how that works. In this example, there's sort of a loose configuration here from the brain to the hand, showing the pathway that touch information would normally come from your hand up to your brain. So with electrical stimulation, we're able to input information directly into this pathway, and we can bypass even the end effector, the hand itself. But despite that, the brain can interpret the signals as if they were coming from the hand because we activated that pathway in a way that the brain can recognize. There are a few different applications that my lab is working on for sensory neurostimulation. A lot of my work has to do with rehabilitation for people with disabilities. This could be for someone who has lost a hand and therefore has no sensation whatsoever below the level of injury because they're missing their hand. And then they're trying to use prosthetic devices, but they're not able to feel anything through those prostheses. So providing sensory neurostimulation is a way to bridge this. Another realm of rehabilitation with sensory neurostimulation is for people who might have nerve injury or spinal cord injury. In a lot of these cases, people lose all sensation below the level of injury, and so they may struggle to perform activities of daily living. And then another application of sensory neurostimulation that I think is emerging, that's really exciting coming forward, is the ways that we might be able to use this technology to augment or enhance sensory capabilities of everyone. In this example, there's a human user here who is operating a virtual reality setup, and she's receiving haptic feedback of the objects she's interacting with in the virtual reality. And I'll talk a little bit about that more at the end of the talk. This was part of the ANA Avatar X Prize that we competed in last September. In the talk today, I have three kind of key points that I'd like to get across. I've organized my talk around sort of three themes or thrusts of my research. The first is how we can shape sensory experiences by changing elements of the stimulation in ways that we're developing stimulation paradigms in order to do this. The second is the way that sensory neurostimulation can be used as a tool to answer some basic science questions. We do a lot of studies where we are investigating the neural coding of sensation and how information is represented in the nervous system. And then finally, what I consider the most important application or the most important point related to sensory neurostimulation is how artificial touch can enhance human connection. So going off the first one here, the work I'm going to discuss today is related to modulating sensory experiences with stimulation paradigms. And specifically, this has been done with peripheral nerve interfaces implanted chronically in people with upper limb loss. We actually have people who've been implanted continuously for the past 10 years without any complications. In these studies, we're using the flat interface nerve electrode, which is a multi-contact electrode. We can activate each contact independently to activate different parts of the nerve to then activate individual groups of axons, these afferents that then can send signals that corresponded to different areas of the hand. So when we apply these currents to the cuff, we're able to evoke sensations on the hand, and we're able to control the locations of these percepts by modulating what nerve we're activating and then also what contact we're stimulating. That's a really easy way to change the location. And these locations, this is an example from a study a few years ago, back in 2014, that the locations are relatively small and they are generally in functionally relevant regions of the hand and fingers. So I just showed you a few locations, but you might be wondering, what does sensory neurostimulation actually feel like? So I have a brief video. I hope that you'll be able to hear it. I hope you'll interrupt me if you cannot hear it very well, but the participant's going to explain what the sensation feels like to him. I wanted to point out that he is wearing a sensorized prosthetic hand during this video. So this hand has sensors on his fingertips. You might notice him pressing the fingertips as he is discussing his experiences. I'm going to talk a lot more about that later on in the talk, but just in case you're wondering what he's doing, that's what that is. So let's play the video.
Some of it is vibration, pressure. Some of it feels like movement starting to draw in some and everything. Some of it just feels like, once these two, it feels like squeezing on the inside of them. When it's all three of them, it feels like somebody grabbing like this and maybe pushing on it a little bit. Same thing when it's through here, it feels like something's right in that area, right through there. So I can feel the light pressure, the vibration, and everything. And it just, some of it just feels natural because it feels like something is right there, that shape.
So in that video, he spoke about many different aspects of the sensation. You might have picked out him talking about the qualities, the modalities he was experiencing, vibrations, pressures. He was talking about locations. He also talked a little bit about feeling movement or proprioceptive sensation. He talked about feeling shape. And so this is all possible because we're developing stimulation paradigms that enable us to modulate these perceptual dimensions. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the progress we've made so far, though I will acknowledge there's a long way to go for us to get to a purely natural sensation that conveys all the important properties of touch. But in the most recent studies, we've been developing strategies to control the sensations produced by stimulation, and we do that by modulating the input signal, the stimulation signal that we provide. My main focus over the past few years has specifically been on temporal patterns of stimulation. The most simple temporal pattern you could think of is just changing the frequency of stimulation. So our stimulation looks like a pulse train. These are usually square pulses, biphasic, but we can change the frequency and then study what the effects are in the perceptual space using classical psychophysical techniques. These studies were also all done with peripheral nerve stimulation. So in our first study, we were looking at how pulse frequency changed the perceived intensity of the sensation. And we found that there was a systematic increase in perceived magnitude corresponding to pulse frequency. In another study, we were looking at instead how the pulse frequency changed the perceived frequency. So this perceived frequency is very similar to acoustical pitch. So you think about having a vibrating element that might be contacting your finger, you can tell maybe how fast it's vibrating. And so that would be the perceived frequency. And we found that people were able to report this perceived frequency independently of changes in intensity. So during the study, we already knew that frequency would modulate intensity. So to kind of obfuscate the informativeness of intensity, we also changed the pulse width, which is labeled here in color on the plot on the right. But we found that at low frequencies, below about 60 hertz, the increases in perceived frequency were driven almost entirely by changes in pulse frequency and were not disrupted by the changes in intensity. However, above about this 60 hertz point, which I've marked here on the plot, this kind of broke down, and pulse frequency no longer was able to modulate perceived frequency. In fact, perceived frequency was almost entirely determined by the intensity of the stimulus, which was controlled by pulse width. So this is kind of interesting that the same input parameter, the same stimulation, pulse frequency, has two different effects. It can both change perceived intensity and perceived frequency. And in perceived intensity, it changes it over a wide frequency range from about 20 to about 175 hertz, whereas in perceived frequency, it has a much more restricted effect. However, there's one other element to this, which is your body's sensitivity to this parameter. We find that in the perceived intensity sphere, with that perceptual dimension, the sensitivity is described by the Weber fraction, and in this case is about 0.4, meaning that you need approximately 40% change relative to a standard stimulus in order to detect a change in pulse frequency. But if someone is instead discriminating on the basis of perceived frequency using the same input of pulse frequency, they now only need a 20% change in input from a standard to detect a difference. So what's interesting about this is that it seems that pulse frequency may be a better modulator of perceived frequency than perceived intensity, and that was able to be determined by these psychophysical studies. We then took this a step further and wondered if pulse frequency might modulate other perceptual dimensions. And one that I have particular interest in is the quality or the modality of the sensation. This is, does it feel like a vibration, or does it feel sharp or rough? So in this study, we asked people to rate different descriptors that might explain the sensations that they're feeling. And they had a whole word bank of these, but we did find that as we changed pulse frequency, there were systematic changes in the proportion of times or the likelihood that they would report different descriptors. And this was consistent within people for specific descriptor words. But one caveat to this, or one difficulty in this sort of data, is that it is very subjective. People may have idiosyncratic word preferences. So someone might pick the word buzzing and somebody else might pick the word flutter. And what does that really mean? So to get around that, in the study, we actually developed a new method of looking at this sort of subjective quality data that we're calling the quality dissimilarity, where we did pairwise comparisons between various stimuli. You can kind of see that in this heat map here, to understand differences or dissimilarities between various stimuli. And from that, we could then go on to do other analyses to better quantify how pulse frequency was in fact modulating quality. And we found that this dissimilarity metric across participants was more consistent, or significantly more consistent than for dissimilarities than it was for descriptors. So in conclusion, throughout these studies, we've shown that pulse frequency can modulate a lot of different aspects of sensation. It can modulate intensity, perceived frequency, and even the sort of multidimensional quality or the subjective quality that we're showing here. And even this effect can be consistent across participants. So pulse frequency is an exciting, simple way to convey different types of sensation to people using neuroprostheses. And there's, I think, much more to come there in that field. Another approach to stimulation patterning that my lab has been pursuing is called biomimicry. The goal of biomimicry is to provide as much information as we can about touch as possible. And for example, we might want to modulate multiple perceptual dimensions at one time. Another goal is to make the sensations feel more natural. This is actually a current issue for sensory neurostimulation in general, that many times the sensations feel qualitatively unnatural. They may feel like tingling or paresthesia, just things that don't feel like normal touch. So the question is, how do we make sensations feel natural? This is the premise of biomimetic stimulation. The idea is that we want to approximate the neural firing patterns that we might see in natural touch. For those who may be unfamiliar, natural touch is transduced through a variety of different receptors in the skin. They're shown here on the left plot. And for something even as simple as a press, hold, and release kind of touch input, you have a very complicated neural activity that is produced. In this plot, this is a raster plot showing spiking activity of different neurons throughout this touch stimulus. This data was actually generated by a model called TouchSim, which was developed by the University of Chicago. It's freely downloadable. I recommend it. So you might see here that there are 600 different neurons. They're all firing at different times. It's very complicated what's occurring in the natural nerve. But if we look at what we think is happening with stimulation, it's a very different story. This is what our models predict that traditional electrical stimulation would produce in the nerve. You might notice there are far fewer neurons activating. It's much more regular. We're not getting that dynamic activity that we might see in natural touch. So this is the goal of biomimicry: is can we develop stimulation paradigms that make the activity from electrical stimulation look more similar, or be more similar, I guess, to the kinds of activity that happen in natural touch. So the first question you have to address here, the most important question, is what does it mean to be similar? What does it mean to mimic? So if we look again at the same touch pattern, there are hundreds of neurons doing many different things on millisecond timescales. How do we actually reproduce this? Ideally, we'd have an interface that was so selective that we could precisely interface with every single afferent, all 600 afferents, and we could precisely control their timing. Unfortunately, this is not true right now with any existing interface. Maybe in the future it will be. But for the time being, we have to make some decisions about what it is that we want to reproduce about this stimulus. So for our first biomimetic study, we decided to pick the neural feature of neural population size. This is shown on the right. Essentially, it's just the summation of the total number of neurons active at any given point in time. This feature we chose because we had previously shown it to be important in a study of intensity perception. So we thought it might be important for reproducing other aspects of the touch experience or improving naturalness. So that's why we went forward with that. Then in order to produce these stimulation patterns, we used a computational model that helps us to select optimal stimulation patterns. Our computational model starts with an image of the person's own nerve. So this is a patient-specific model to make sure that these patterns are applicable to real-world use cases. So this picture is actually an intraoperative ultrasound taken at the time that the cuff electrode was placed around the nerve in the OR. We then use a finite element model to predict how these fascicles, these internals of the nerve, are related or are structured relative to our electrode. And then we can apply stimulation in a neural activation model to see how the neurons might be activated when we apply stimulation, for example, through this red contact. And we can see both how many neurons as well as which specific neurons are activated as we change stimulation parameters, for example, pulse amplitude. So in this first study that we did, we decided that we're only going to do single contact stimulation. There was too much already going on. We could change other parameters, but we wanted to say only one contact could be active at a time, and that'll become relevant in a second. So when we built this pattern, we used our model to predict what the activity might look like in response to our single contact biomimetic electrical stimulation. And this is shown here on the right in comparison to the natural touch neural activity on the left. So you might notice there are still a few discrepancies. We have some neurons firing perhaps during the middle portion that should not be, but all in all, the holistic pattern is much more similar to that of natural touch than the previous traditional patterns were. So we then took these patterns and we decided to test them in people who had these sorts of peripheral nerve interfaces. We tested these in a set of both upper and lower limb amputees, and they were asked to rate the perceived naturalness of the sensations elicited. We did this for both biomimetic stimuli and traditional time invariant stimuli. In other words, the stimulation parameters were not varying in time. So this is what our data look like. The biomimetic responses are in green and the time invariant is in blue. And I want to draw your attention to these two people who both felt that the biomimetic stimuli were significantly more natural than the time invariant stimuli. And this is what we expected to happen, or we hoped would happen with our new patterns. But you might also notice that the other participants either could not distinguish a difference or felt that the biomimetic patterns were less natural than the time invariant patterns. Now, I think there's a lot of potential reasons for this. There could be participant-specific preferences and the kinds of stimuli that they like to have. And also, this was the largest study, to my knowledge, of human biomimetic stimulation that's been done in the past. So it just may be true that there are these participant-specific preferences. But another hypothesis was that there could have been some limitations in our stimulation paradigm. I kind of talked about some of the choices we made as we were developing the stimulation paradigm that we then chose to reevaluate. So the first was that we were basing our patterns on a single neural feature, which was that population size. And there wasn't really a clear reason for why that might relate to naturalness. The second problem was that we chose to only do single contact stimulation, but in our model, it was very clear that this severely restricted the variability in the kinds of neural populations that we could achieve with stimulation. So we then decided to kind of go back to the drawing board and create some new biomimetic stimulation paradigms. And this was part of the DARPA I&I program that we were funded to do for a few years. So our goals in this program were to develop a multi-contact biomimetic stimulation approach to include more neural features, and also to use artificial intelligence approaches to help us select our stimulation parameters. So I talked about the neural features of touch. Previously, we just had this neural population size, but we added in 3 other features, the neural firing rate, the afferent type, and the afferent location in the finger. And then we developed an optimization approach that was based on a series of computational models. So the first model was this model of natural touch. So I talked about touch sim. We generated a bunch of data with this model for various touch stimuli. We then, for each of these stimuli, converted into a neural profile, or a set of neural profiles. A neural profile is essentially just a time slice of the data. This is an index finger you're looking at there. This is an example of a profile. It's a collection of afferents that are active at one particular time point. And we can also look at that then in our nerve space. So this is kind of a cross-section of a nerve inside of our flat interface nerve electrode. And this is the same exact neural profile and how it's oriented relative spatially to the electrode. We then used a particle swarm optimization, which was our machine learning approach here, to generate stimulation paradigms that we predicted might get us close to that neural profile. And then we iterated on this by updating it relative to our biophysical electrical model to see how those stimulation parameters then influenced the neural population in our cuff electrode, and to then update the parameters to get us to the closest solution. And the outcome was this multi-contact biomimetic stimulation paradigm that we're calling the centipede paradigm. So this is an example of what the centipede paradigm looks like for a kind of press, hold, and release touch stimulus. The centipede paradigm was able to select both pulse amplitude and pulse width on a pulse-by-pulse basis. It also could select across contacts on a pulse-by-pulse basis. You might notice there are about 7 there that were selected at various time points. And they were selected at different proportions. And this was just so that the model could get as close as possible to the neural profile. So it was able to freely select the contact that it needed to get as close as possible to that population that it was aiming to produce. We then, in simulation, took this pattern that we had developed and wanted to compare it to some existing neurostimulation paradigms. We compared it to 4 different paradigms, kind of at varying levels of complexity. So the first paradigm is just a fixed pulse paradigm. There's no changes in the parameter. The second paradigm is where you might just directly modulate a parameter like pulse amplitude based on that force signal that I showed you for our press, hold, and release stimulus. The third was a sinusoidal based, and the fourth was this neural population size based, which was our previous attempts at biomimicry. So we compared our novel centipede paradigm to each of these in our computational model, and we predicted the neural error for these. So the idea here is that we took the centipede error minus the error from the comparison paradigm. And in this plot, things in the green region mean that the neural error predicted by our model was lower for the centipede paradigm, our new paradigm, than for any of these previous stimuli. And those in the red or kind of orange area there show that the error was higher for the centipede than the comparison. So what was clear from this data is that in all cases, our centipede performed better, and it performed even better, significantly so, than our previous attempts at biomimicry. So our next step here is to now take these patterns, or take the centipede paradigm and test it in humans. We have not yet been able to do that, but we're moving towards that now and trying to implement that technically. But this is encouraging. The simulation results are encouraging that the results in humans could be even better than what we saw previously with our biomimetic stimuli, which did have some moderate success. Oh, and one other thing is that we wondered if the results of our centipede paradigm might have just been because we were using a particular optimization approach that maybe selected specific values or something like that. So we actually made our paradigm, our optimization, run on a one-contact biomimetic approach. And we found that in nearly all cases, our centipede paradigm still outperforms the one contact version of the same thing, even the same optimization approach, showing that it really isn't just this optimization. There's something about the ability to select between contacts that's really important. So again, our next step for this is to test it in humans, and my student Tanya is working on a paper to kind of wrap this up and publish her results. Okay, so moving on to the next section about how we've been using sensory neurostimulation as a tool to study neural coding and neural representations. The reason that sensory neurostimulation is useful as a tool to study neural coding is because with stimulation, we're able to actually write or inject specific information into the nerves in a controllable way that can be very difficult to do in natural touch. We can precisely control, for example, the frequency of firing of afferents separately from perhaps which afferents are activated. And then we can then determine the consequences on perception when we make these specific modulations in the neural code. So my first study that I conducted to investigate neural coding was actually when I was in graduate school. I'm just going to briefly summarize that. We were looking at perceived intensity, or how strong or how weak these stimuli felt to people receiving peripheral nerve stimulation. These were amputees. So we applied the stimulation and we used psychophysics to measure intensity, and we compared the effects of pulse width and pulse frequency. Our initial look at the data seemed to indicate that pulse width had a much stronger effect on perceived intensity than pulse frequency. But we then did some more thinking and thought about the problem from the standpoint of neural coding. What are these parameters actually influencing within the nerve? So if we have a population like this, some population of neurons, let's say we have 4 neurons here, we could change pulse width and thereby increase the population size. This is a pretty reproducible relationship that's been studied for a number of years. So in this example, we're doubling it to 8 neurons. But if we change pulse frequency, we would be changing the firing rate of that same population. That 4 neuron population is just now firing more frequently. So based on this kind of knowledge, we developed a new metric we call the activation charge rate, or ACR, which kind of combined our stimulation parameters, but with this knowledge in mind, thinking about how pulse width and pulse frequency were actually influencing the population. And we found that when we express now our data, our perceived magnitude data, in response to activation charge rate, now the changes in intensity were based on activation charge rate, regardless of whether pulse width or pulse frequency were modulated. And so thinking about what this means is that essentially the neural coding principle here is that it doesn't matter whether you increase the number of neurons with pulse width or you increase the frequency of firing of pulse frequency. The goal, the overall outcome is that you increase the total spike rate of your population, the total number of spikes in your population, and that intensity is in fact correlated to this number rather than to any other specific stimulation parameter. So this is useful from the neuroprosthetic standpoint because this helps guide the way in which we can modulate intensity for people using sensorized prosthetics. For example, if they're trying to modulate the force that they're applying on an object, that can be important. But it's also important from the neuroscience standpoint because without being able to modulate these 2 parameters independently, it was really hard to decouple these relative effects in able-bodied models. So in addition to these stimulation studies that I was talking about, we can also now directly measure neural coding in the cortex in humans through a new study that's ongoing here in Cleveland called Reconnecting the Hand and Arm to the Brain. It's a clinical trial that's led by Dr. Jonathan Miller and Dr. Bolu Ajiboye here at Case Western. And this study is enrolling participants with high-level tetraplegia. So these are people who are paralyzed from the neck down. They cannot volitionally activate any of their limbs. And the system that we've developed here allows us to implant microelectrode arrays in their cortex through a surgery. This participant that we have implanted so far has 6 64-channel arrays implanted in his cortex. He has 2 in the motor, 2 in sensory, and 2 in association areas. And here's a picture of his brain kind of showing those implant locations after the surgery. This participant also has peripheral nerve stimulation electrodes. They're actually the same exact electrodes that we have used in our previous amputee studies for sensory restoration, but they're implanted around 8 different nerves in his upper extremity. And the goal here is to activate his musculature with electrical stimulation. The goal of this whole program is to essentially bridge the gap between the damaged part of the spinal cord and be able to record and decode information from his brain as he's trying to volitionally control actions of his upper limb, and then actually implement those actions in his own body and have him move his own hand under volitional control. So this system is combining a brain-computer interface with FES control of arm and hand function. In this task that you're watching here, the participant is viewing a screen in front of him that gives him some target postures to attain. And then he is volitionally attaining those postures, those targets, by thinking about them. So he's thinking about a particular target he wants to reach. We've trained a decoder that is taking in data from his motor cortex to then activate a stimulation controller, which activates his muscles in his upper limb. This was actually the very first session we did this. This was only a few weeks ago. We just were able to implement this and close the loop. So this is a 1 degree of freedom task that he's doing right now. You might notice, he's doing it over to the side there. So the FES is flexing his elbow and it's also extending his wrist to keep his hand sort of in a neutral posture. So like I said, this is very early, but I do want to point out, he sometimes is concentrating pretty hard, but also kind of the smile on his face as he's doing this. This was a pretty emotional day for him. This was the first time he's been able to move his own arm in 6 years. So the next steps for this are to add in more degrees of freedom beyond just the single degree of freedom acquisition task we're doing now, and to move towards controlling his hand and individual finger movements, and eventually move towards completing activities of daily living. So again, this is towards the overall goal of this project to restore hand and arm function, but there's also this opportunity to use this system to help us investigate neural coding of touch. We can do this for both natural touch and stimulation elicited touch. So in terms of stimulation, this participant has 2 arrays that are placed in his primary somatosensory cortex. Kind of where those are positioned relative to the central sulcus is shown on the left. And from these 2 arrays, we've begun to characterize the kinds of sensations we can produce by direct brain stimulation. So far, we have most sensations between the index, middle, and ring fingers. And primarily these sensations, he describes them as sort of a squeezing on both sides of the finger, as if somebody were kind of wrapping their hand around it and squeezing his finger. So we can then, the next steps here are to continue characterizing these sensations, and also to develop new paradigms in order to produce multi-location touch or multi-dimensional information to improve task performance. Our system, though, also offers a pretty exciting opportunity to directly study sensory neural coding in somatosensory cortex. And this is because our participant has a sensory incomplete spinal cord injury. So although he is not able to move any of his limbs, he does have sensation, and actually near normal sensation in his hands and arms. On about 4 of his 5 digits, he has about normal sensory capabilities. So in one set of experiments that my student Bree Hutchison has been working on is looking at how somatosensory cortex represents mechanical stimuli delivered to his fingers via a tactor. This tactor is able to precisely control the time course and the magnitude of touch stimuli delivered to his finger. She can then record in primary somatosensory cortex to see the firing of individual units or multi-unit activity. This is one example on one electrode in the cortex. And in this example, the time interval between the 2 lines is when the stimulus was applied. So we can kind of start looking at the time course of firing and how that changes. And then in her first study that she's been working on right now is comparing the time course of the firing rate across indentation depths and indentation rates in this mechanical touch stimuli. So this is her kind of initial results. And I should actually say a caveat here is that none of this data yet has been peer reviewed or published, so take it with a grain of salt. But her early data demonstrates that we can see modulation in primary somatosensory cortex that corresponds to both changes in depth in the periphery, as well as changes in the indentation rate, though the effects of indentation rate on cortical activity seems to be much stronger than indentation depth. And in fact, this is not entirely surprising because there was a primary study that was very similar to this in a non-human primate model at the University of Chicago. They found very similar results that in their study, they saw more modulation in somatosensory cortex in response to changes in rate than in responses to depth. So I think the good news here is that we're seeing very similar results, but the exciting opportunity is that we can verify these prior findings in non-human primate studies now with a human model, and we can then even extend into different areas of sensory neuroscience and really get an understanding of how human brain represents sensory information. So then going back to sensory neurostimulation and how we can understand neural coding with sensory neurostimulation, we have also the opportunity in the rehab study to look at cortical activity evoked by peripheral nerve stimulation. So this participant does have these peripheral nerve arrays or electrode cuffs that were implanted in his nerves, and they were primarily for FES, but because he has a sensory incomplete injury and he retains sensation, activation of his nerves also is activating sensory function in his nerve. So this is an example of some of the data that my student Preeti Bhatt has been collecting, looking at the percepts evoked through stimulation of the median nerve. She's then begun to quantify how perceptual dimensions like intensity are modulated by changes in stimulation pulse width. This kind of effect here, where we see an increase in perceived intensity with increasing pulse width, we actually previously found this in amputees. So it's exciting that we're seeing a very similar effect here, even with somebody with an incomplete spinal cord injury. She can then also stimulate the peripheral nerve to evoke a sensation, for example, of index finger touch, and then also record in the brain. This is an example of two different electrode contacts in primary somatosensory cortex. And here in these plots, the red line is indicating the onset of the stimuli. So what's exciting about this is that we can, in fact, record activity in the brain that is corresponding to these peripheral stimulation evoked touch sensations. And so, we're confirming that we can detect this activation. And there's also already some interesting findings here. I, for example, see this really strong onset response, even though the peripheral nerve stimuli do not have any differences. These particular stimuli are time invariant. There's no changes at the onset that would be causing this sort of change that we're seeing here at the onset in the cortex. So this is a really interesting test bed to investigate different peripheral nerve stimulation patterns or peripheral nerve stimulation inputs, and then how they might be influencing cortical activity. And so Preeti has been looking at time series of her data. This is essentially a normalized firing rate plot showing the time course and how it changes relative to changes in the peripheral nerve stimulation pulse width, which is here indicated by color. She's looking at both pulse widths below threshold and above threshold, which is here 0 is the threshold in this plot. And then she's looking at how the peak of this activity might be changing with pulse width. So again, this is really early. This is unpublished work right now, but I think there's really a lot of exciting opportunities here where we can inject specific information with peripheral nerve stimulation, specific neural codes in the periphery, and then see the downstream effects in cortex. And then as we're developing these new stimulation paradigms that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, we can then compare the cortical activity between paradigms, or even compare it to the activity evoked by natural touch to better understand how to develop better peripheral nerve stimulation paradigms in the future.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it, but are you, this is not my field, so I don't quite understand what people do, but I'm assuming that when you have a limb, there's a lot of different places you could stimulate. And so is the idea then to stimulate like one side if the touch is supposed to be on that side and the other side on the other side? So how do you deal with the spatial part? And is it all the same sort of PWM signal just being sent in different intensities, or just being sent or not being sent to sort of encode the spatial aspect of what the person's supposed to be feeling?
Yeah, so the way that we kind of encode the location, I think that's what you're asking about first. So there are different nerves that innervate different parts of your hand. This is just, in normal biology. And so we can target, let's say, these 3 fingers, which are innervated by the median nerve, differently from these 2 fingers, which are typically innervated by the ulnar nerve, by what nerve we are stimulating. And then within those different innervation territories, we can get different locations on the hand by stimulating through different contacts, which essentially activates different parts of the nerve. So I don't know how familiar you are with this, but nerves are organized into groupings called fascicles, which are bundles of individual afferents or individual neural axons. And so we're trying to target different fascicles to get at these different parts around the hand. However, it does take a mapping. We do have to map per person because we don't yet have a full dictionary of what these nerve layouts could be. So for every participant we get in, we have to spend a period of time where we try stimulation through every individual contact and at various levels to understand kind of what locations they are perceiving and how it's associated with specific electrode contacts.
Okay, that makes sense. And so then I guess my follow-up question, which was what I was really wondering, is do you ever do things like control or modulate the phase or the delay that you get from one neural sort of, stimulation point to the other? So for example, in psychoacoustics, you can encode directionality by having a slight delay between when you hear the sound of something. Is that something that you can control with these PWM signals? Because you have control over phase as well as just
Yes, I should probably clarify that when I'm saying pulse width modulation, it probably means something different than what you're saying for PWM. The reason I'm saying pulse width is because the stimuli that we apply are typically square pulses, but they are biphasic, so they're not exactly the same sort of maybe pulses that you're referring to. So there's a cathodal phase, which is generally where we think the activation is occurring, and then we have an anodal phase to essentially reset the charge balance within the body. This is to preserve the electrode interface over time. We essentially, every amount of charge we want to put in, we want to pull back out, so we're not building up any sort of byproducts. Anyway, that's why we have a biphasic signal. And so within those pulses, we can change different parts of them. And one thing we can modulate is the pulse width. And usually when I say pulse width modulation, I'm specifically talking about the cathodal phase, which is usually the excitatory phase. In terms of your question about kind of combining effects across contacts, this is definitely something that I think would be very exciting to look at in peripheral nerve stimulation. We've done a little bit of this work, and some students here at CASE are looking into that, ways that we could kind of change the timing between different areas of the nerve. There's also this concept called field shaping, where you try to set up these like more complicated voltage fields around the nerve using multiple points, multiple catheters or multiple anodes simultaneously to create these shapes that might then change which particular neurons are activated at a given point in time. So these are all techniques that we can combine together to develop these sensory paradigms. The limitation, though, is that a lot of these studies that I'm doing are in humans, and their experimental time can be limited, right? They can only come in so often. So that's why we're trying to leverage models as much as we can to investigate some of these things in simulation first, because these experiments just take a long time.
Great, thank you so much for answering my questions.
No, thank you for the question. That was great. Okay, so let's move on to the last point of my talk today, which is how artificial touch can enhance human connection. So let's talk again about the sensory-enabled prosthetic devices that we've been developing here in Cleveland. You saw a participant who was talking about his experience while he was wearing one of these devices, but essentially the hand has some sensors in the fingertips, and this can send information to a neurostimulator, which then converts the information into a stimulation pulse stream, which is sent to his cuff to create a sensation of touch. In these systems, we typically set him up with 4 different points of information. He'll have pressure sensors on his thumb, index, and middle fingers, which are associated with touch percepts on these areas. And then he also has an aperture sensor within his hand, which measures the degree of hand opening, which then is conveyed to him either through a sensory substitution tactile location on his palm, or it could even be a proprioceptive sensation that he feels like his hand is closing. And here's a picture of the participant actually donning that system. So we've now been able to investigate the effects of enabling sensation on prosthesis function, both in the lab using standardized measures of object discrimination or object localization, but also at home. We've now done a few home studies where people took these devices out of the lab and were able to use them autonomously to complete tasks of daily living, chores around their house, and also to interact with their friends and family. In this video, the participant is kind of just demonstrating some of the tasks he was doing around his house. So in the lab, we see improvements to function, prosthesis function, when he has sensation. So this is a task called the foam block task, where he is blindfolded and just asked to determine whether a foam block is small, medium, large, or soft, medium, or hard. And so he performs significantly better when he's given sensation than when he is not. Also, his perception of his abilities improves, so he feels more confident, like he's going to be more successful when he has sensation than without. And in one of our studies, a person used the sensory system at home for 3 months, and we had him come in every month after every interval and rate his perceived abilities to do various tasks around his house. And we also found that that improved over time. So with learning and with accumulating familiarity with this system, he was able to improve not only his actual abilities, but also his perception of his abilities over time. And to me, some of the most important outcomes of this study were the effects on the psychosocial experiences of participants. So we also had people fill out surveys related to their psychosocial experience. And we saw that when they had sensation at home, they had improvements in many of these experiences. So in this study, it was a little bit different setup. They wore the system at home for 6 weeks, but they only had sensation enabled in the middle 2 weeks. But they had to still fill out these surveys and all these measures daily. So in this particular data set, we saw that participants felt more confident in their abilities, which here is rated as self-efficacy. They felt like they could use their prostheses more effectively in social situations, such as shaking hands or giving a hug. They felt like they had stronger embodiment of the prosthesis, which is feeling like the prosthesis is actually part of their body. And they also felt like their prosthesis was more efficient to use. They felt like it did not slow them down as much as when they did not have sensation. So I think this is really well encapsulated. I'm going to show you another video of the participant kind of using his own words to explain how having sensation at home impacted him.
My granddaughters, they've grabbed a hold of my hand. If I'm not watching close enough, I squeeze a little tight and they're like, ow, let go. Because without sensation, can't tell. With sensation on, I grabbed her with both hands and picked her up and could actually feel that I was holding her and not squeezing too tight. And she gave me a big hug. That gets to me.
So I really like this video because I think it really shows the impact that this sensorized prosthesis had on this participant, and specifically how he was able to interact with his family. This participant also told us that prior to joining the study, prior to having the sensation, he would not want to pick up his granddaughter because he was afraid that he might squeeze her too tight or drop her. But then after having sensation, he had the confidence to pick her up again, and that was a big impact to his life. So one of my focuses of my lab is to continue down this avenue to further examine how sensory neurostimulation can enhance social and emotional connection. This could be for people who've lost a limb and therefore do not have the ability to intake this sensory information from a large part of their limb. So can we improve the connection of amputees with their loved ones by providing sensory neurostimulation that attempts to reproduce this sorts of input? But then sort of transitioning towards how this might impact everyone, how this might impact able-bodied people, sensory neurostimulation could also be a means to convey emotional and touch information across distances. So many of us, unfortunately, may have had instances during the pandemic where we were isolated from our loved ones or we were not able to go to see them. And this can be really impactful, especially in stressful circumstances or an illness. So are there ways that we can develop sensory neurostimulation paradigms that can be applicable to able-bodied devices that can enable emotional connection at a distance? So towards this aim, we've been working on developing a non-invasive haptic interface that can be just worn on the hand. This is transcutaneous electrical stimulation, and this is through the Human Fusions Institute. So here in this demo, the user has the interface on her finger, and she's using it to touch virtual objects. Her goal is to touch these bubbles without popping them, and if she does that successfully, they turn green, and if she pops them, they turn red. And she's able to do this because the haptic feedback that she's getting is modulating how much force that she is applying onto these objects. We also then, instead of it being a virtual world, can move towards real world situations, but just in a remote or a different location. So we've been working on teleoperation setups using this sort of haptic interface via an avatar system we developed through the Human Fusions Institute. And this was for the ANA Avatar X Prize competition that we actually competed in semifinals in September. So one of our collaborators in the Human Fusions Institute is Veronica Santos at UCLA, who kind of leads the robotics side, but HFI also includes many collaborators across the country. So in this system, we have a human operator who is directly controlling a robot. He's able to move various degrees of freedom of a hand and a wrist and an arm, as well as the head of the robot. And he's also receiving feedback from the robot in the form of visual information, auditory information, as well as tactile feedback that he's getting through the haptic glove. And this system actually was entirely developed in COVID. So it was teleoperated from the start, where the robot was at UCLA with our collaborators there with Dr. Santos, and the human interfaces side was in Cleveland. We actually didn't meet in person as a team until we were in semifinals testing in Miami this September. So I'm going to show you a brief video kind of showing this avatar system and how it could be used. This video is a little staged. You'll notice that this was actually our semifinal submission, but I wanted to kind of give you some ideas of the capabilities of this kind of system, so maybe it would spur some ideas of how this might be useful for healthcare or many other social connection tasks. In this particular example, you're going to see how someone's using an avatar to complete a healthcare task.
In this scenario, a medical professional remotely teaches a medical student how to clean a wound on a patient's hand.
Hello, I am Dr. Luis Macias, and today I'll be teaching you how to clean a wound.
Hi, my name is Lionel. I'm a student here at UCLA, and I'll be learning how to clean the wound today.
Nice to meet you, Lionel. Who do we have here?
So this is going to be our patient, Eric, today. He has a slight burn on his left hand that we'll be cleaning.
Nice to meet you, Dr. Macias.
Nice to meet you too.
Alright, so to start with, we gotta grab a sponge. Alright, then we're gonna dip the sponge in iodine solution. Then we approach the patient and we apply firm pressure. Please let me know if you feel any discomfort or if you have any concerns.
Sounds good. I'll let you know.
All right.
Great.
Do you have any questions, Lionel?
No, I think that's pretty clear.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So here you go. You can have the sponge.
Okay, so I hope that video kind of demonstrated maybe what we're trying to accomplish here. This is just one task of many, but the vision of the Human Fusions Institute is to develop these sorts of systems either for virtual reality or for real-world application of tele-robotics, tele-embodiment, potentially in healthcare situations to improve access to care, to redefine the future of remote workplaces, to change interactivity of gaming and entertainment. And to me, the most important part is to enhance social interaction and human connection. So if anyone is interested in learning more about the Human Fusions Institute, I'd be happy to tell you more about it. We're always looking for new collaborators, so come join our team. Okay, so here are my key points today. We talked about how stimulation paradigms can help us shape sensory experiences, how sensory neurostimulation can be a tool to study neural coding, and also how we're beginning to see that artificial touch can enhance human connection. So with that, I'd like to thank the ANA Avatar X Prize team and my lab and my many collaborators at CASE. So please ask any questions you have, and thank you so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really fantastic. Do we have questions from the audience? Anyone? So I'll ask a question while any other folks are maybe thinking of one. One question I often have with these interfaces is how, and you sort of alluded to this in a few places, sort of how consistent they are. So in particular, within a subject over time, for instance, are there changes in kind of the perceived sensations with a given stimulation or not?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. In general, the locations are very stable. So if we find out that contact 3 on the median nerve goes to the thumb, it is almost entirely always the thumb. Now, I will say that there can be a little bit of changes in the first month or so after implant. This is just as the cuff is sort of being encapsulated, there's some scar tissue forming. It can shift a little bit during that time, but after about a month out, it's very consistent. We have not seen many changes. However, day to day, we do see changes in threshold. Now, these may not be large, but for example, if I was going to say the threshold was a pulse width was 100 on one day, it might be 110 the next day, or maybe 90 on a different day, right? So we can kind of move up and down. And I don't know all the reasons for this. It could be small micro changes in the interface relative to the nerve because these are extraneural, but it also might be changes in excitability within the whole nervous system. I think we're beginning to investigate that a little bit more so in our patient with spinal cord injury because he does have he has a lot of differences in his excitability and his spasticity from day to day, which seem to be impacting the threshold. So in terms of locations, I say very stable in terms of thresholds, and therefore the things that come after thresholds like intensities, there can be a little bit of variability day to day. So every time we do an experiment, we usually have them kind of do a threshold at the beginning just to make sure we're on the right track. But I will say when we sent people home with this, they did not have to modulate their parameters very often. So they had the ability to freely change the stimulation parameters if they needed to. But after the first couple of days, once they kind of found settings they liked, they would just keep them. So I think the good news is that as we're developing these neuroprostheses for maybe commercial or clinical applications, I think there's beginning to be proof that they can be stable and they won't need to be tuned very often.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Let's see, we've got a question in the chat from Charlotte. You can feel free to unmute if you want to ask your question, or I can read it as well. Okay, I will go ahead and read it. So Charlotte asks if your participants, have they given any feedback on what changes they would like to see in sensory stimulation to help further enhance their experiences? So kind of what kind of input did they have?
Yeah, that's a great question, Charlotte. I didn't present any of this work here, but actually that's another kind of aim of my research is to include the participants more directly in this process. So we're doing a lot of qualitative studies, which involves interviewing participants and then kind of using that data to then better understand their experiences and perspectives. But kind of directly to your point, I think there are a lot of things that they would want to improve. When they were at home with the sensation, they actually gave me specific feedback that they wanted to see change that we were then able to implement like the next week that they came in, and we could make an improvement. For example, one participant, he received kind of a continuous sensation of it was related to his aperture sensor. So he was getting that sensation all the time when his hand was closed. And so if he was like holding a bottle of water and walking down the hall, he was just continuously getting that sensation. He said, hey, that's kind of distracting. Can you decrease that? And we said, yeah, sure. So we kind of build in like a timer so that if it was on for a certain amount of time, it would kind of attenuate down. And he really liked that. I think in general, the participants would love to get more different qualities or modalities of the sensation. Like I mentioned, we're beginning to look at that with some of these pulse frequencies and some of these patterning studies, but we still have a long way to go to really get the full breadth of sensory quality experiences, textures, for example. So I think those are some key areas that we want to work on improving.
Great. All right, well, I think we're about out of time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thank you so much for that, a really fantastic talk.
All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was great to be here, and look forward to talking to you more later.
Yeah, great. Take care, everyone.